Halifax, Nova Scotia, December 6, 1917, 9:46 in the morning. In seconds, 2,700 tons of explosives detonated in the heart of the busiest port on the North Atlantic. The shockwave traveled at more than 1,000 meters per second, completely destroying the Richmond neighborhood. Windows exploded 80 kilometers away. A column of smoke rose 6 kilometers above the city. A tsunami was generated by the explosion and crossed the entire bay. But 3 hours before that, Halifax was simply an ordinary city. The children of Richmond were walking down the steep streets toward their schools. The women whose husbands were in the trenches of France were checking the mailbox, hoping for a letter. The port workers were arriving for another shift loading ammunition and supplies onto the ships departing for Europe. The Mont-Blanc had just finished being loaded with 2,700 tons of picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and benzene, the largest concentration of explosives a single ship had ever carried in history, stored in the holds and on deck with no visible danger markings on the exterior. And, at a nearby anchorage, a Norwegian ship called Imo was waiting for authorization to depart toward the same port entrance channel that the Mont-Blanc would travel the following morning. The city sleeping that Wednesday night had no idea of the danger those two ships would represent hours later. Halifax in 1917 was the most strategic port in the Western Hemisphere. It sat 950 kilometers closer to London than New York. And when Britain entered the war in 1914 and Canada automatically followed, Halifax became overnight the mandatory embarkation point for everything the British war effort needed: soldiers, ammunition, food, horses, medical equipment, steel, coal. In 1917, the port processed more than 100 ships per month. Before the war, that number was fewer than 20. That transformation had completely changed the city. Halifax had 50,000 inhabitants in 1914. By 1917, the population had grown to more than 60,000, with workers arriving from every Canadian province in search of employment at the port and in the factories that had sprung up to meet the demands of the war. New neighborhoods grew on the slopes above the port at a speed the city's infrastructure could not keep up with. Richmond, the neighborhood closest to the docks, had doubled in size in less than 3 years. The families of Richmond lived the war in a way the rest of Canada did not. Husbands worked at the port loading ammunition destined for the trenches of Europe. Older sons had left as soldiers in the first years of the conflict. And the letters arriving from France and Belgium described conditions that no one in Halifax could fully imagine. The women who stayed managed the homes, raised the children, and in many cases also worked in the factories and military hospitals that had multiplied across the city. The churches held regular memorial services for men from Halifax who had died in Europe, and the casualty lists published in the local newspapers were read every morning with a silent anxiety that every family carried without talking about it much. The children of Richmond grew up in a neighborhood where the port cranes and the warships anchored in the bay were a natural part of their everyday landscape. The public schools of the neighborhood sat a few meters from the port, close enough for the children to hear the ship's horns during class. In 1917, Richmond was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where families had built their lives over generations, and where the war, despite happening thousands of kilometers away, was present in every home, every dinner table, and every letter that arrived, or did not arrive, from Europe. The port that sustained all of this was also the most dangerous port in the world at that moment, though no one in Halifax thought of it that way. Hundreds of ships loaded with explosives, ammunition, and fuel entered and left the Halifax Channel every week, passing meters from each other in a space that had been designed for far smaller traffic. The port bureaucracy was overwhelmed. The pilots guiding ships through the channel worked exhausting shifts, and the navigation rules determining which ship had right-of-way and which situation were applied inconsistently in a port that had grown too fast to be managed with rigor. The Mont-Blanc was a French cargo ship of 5,900 tons that had arrived in Halifax on December 5th coming from New York. where it had been loaded with the largest concentration of explosives a single ship had ever carried in history. In the holds, tons of picric acid and TNT packed in wooden crates. On deck, 243 barrels of benzene stacked on top of each other. In total, 2,700 tons of material capable of destroying an entire city, transported on a ship with no visible danger markings on the exterior. The danger flag that ships carrying explosives were required to raise had been removed to avoid attracting the attention of German submarines operating in the North Atlantic. Captain Aimé Le Medec of the Mont-Blanc knew exactly what he was carrying. His officers knew. The crew knew. What they did not know was that the port of Halifax had not been informed in advance about the precise nature of the cargo, and that the Canadian pilot Francis Mackey, responsible for guiding the ship through the entrance channel, had received only a generic description of the explosives on board without fully understanding the scale of the danger he was piloting into the busiest port on the North Atlantic. The Imo was a Norwegian cargo ship that had arrived in Halifax days earlier coming from Belgium and was anchored in Bedford Basin, waiting for authorization to depart for New York to load humanitarian supplies. The authorization had arrived too late in the afternoon of December 5th for the Imo to leave port before the nightly closure of the channel, and Captain Håkon Frum had spent the night anchored in the bay with growing pressure to make up for the delay the following morning. On the morning of December 6th, the Imo left its anchorage earlier than usual and entered the port entrance channel, traveling faster than the rules allowed. The port entrance channel of Halifax, called the Narrows, was less than 900 meters wide at its narrowest point. The navigation rules required ships entering the port to travel on the right side of the channel, and ships leaving to travel on the left side, exactly like traffic on a two-lane road. On the morning of December 6th, the Mont-Blanc was entering on the correct side of the channel. The Imo was leaving, but had drifted to the wrong side to avoid other ships earlier in its route, and had not returned to its correct position when the Mont-Blanc appeared ahead. The two ships saw each other with enough time to avoid the collision. What followed was a sequence of navigation signals exchanged between the two captains that lasted minutes, but in which every decision made things worse instead of better. The Mont-Blanc turned left. The Imo turned left too. The Mont-Blanc tried to turn back right. The Imo put the engines in reverse, but a 5,000-ton ship does not stop in seconds. At 9 hours and 4 minutes on the morning of December 6, 1917, the bow of the Imo cut into the starboard hull of the Mont-Blanc, knocking over the benzene barrels stacked on deck and generating sparks that ignited the fuel spread across the deck. The fire that started at that moment was visible from across the city, and Richmond residents who were at the windows of their homes or on the neighborhood streets stopped to watch the burning ship drifting in the channel, with no idea what was inside it. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the schools of Richmond opened at 8:30, and the neighborhood children came down the steep streets toward their classrooms with their wool coats buttoned to the neck against the dry cold of the Nova Scotia winter. In the neighborhood bakeries, the first customers of the day drank coffee standing at the counter before heading to work. In the houses where husbands were in Europe, women organized the day alone, taking the children to school, opening the windows to air the bedrooms, and checking the mailbox in the hope of a letter that sometimes took weeks to arrive from the trenches. Vincent Coleman was 43 years old and had worked as chief dispatcher at the telegraph office of the Richmond railway station for more than a decade. It was one of the most important positions on the railway in eastern Canada, responsible for coordinating the arrival and departure of the trains that brought military supplies for the ships and took soldiers to embark. On that Thursday morning, Coleman had arrived at the office at his usual time and was at his desk in front of the telegraph machine when the Mont-Blanc and the Imo collided in the channel less than 500 meters away. In the windows of the Richmond houses overlooking the bay, residents who looked at the channel that morning saw the Mont-Blanc drifting with its deck in flames, sending a thick column of black smoke toward the winter sky. The scene was unusual enough to stop people in the middle of their morning activities, but not terrifying enough to cause panic. Ship fires happened. The port had firefighting equipment. The authorities would sort it out. Across the city, people moved to windows, verandas, and the waterfront to watch the burning ship. At the Halifax fire station, truck number 4 departed toward the pier to fight the fire, the firefighters unaware of what the ship was carrying. At the Richmond pier, port workers stopped what they were doing and moved toward the water for a better look. In the neighborhood schools, children got up from their desks and went to the windows. On a Thursday in December in Halifax, a ship burning in the port was the most interesting event anyone had seen in weeks. What no one knew was that the Mont-Blanc's crew had abandoned the ship shortly after the collision and was rowing toward the Dartmouth shore on the other side of the bay, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the ship before the inevitable explosion. The French sailors knew exactly what was about to happen. They knew there was nothing they could do to prevent it, and they knew that when it happened, they did not want to be anywhere near the Mont-Blanc. The crew had not managed to warn anyone on shore in time. Between the collision at 9 hours and 4 minutes and the explosion at 9 hours and 46 minutes, 42 minutes passed. 42 minutes in which the Mont-Blanc drifted in flames toward the Richmond pier while hundreds of people moved closer to watch, and the firefighters from truck number 4 worked to fight a fire that had no solution. The heat of the fire on deck was progressively heating the holds where the picric, acid, and TNT were stored. The remaining benzene barrels on deck fed the flames. The temperature inside the ship rose every minute. The firefighters who arrived at the pier had no way of knowing this. They saw a ship on fire and did what they had been trained to do, brought the truck close, connected the hoses, and began fighting the flames as efficiently as they could. It was a colleague of Coleman's at the telegraph office who managed to speak with a member of the Mont-Blanc crew who had reached shore. The message was simple and devastating. The ship was carrying 2,700 tons of explosives and was going to explode. Coleman immediately began evacuating the office when he realized that trains loaded with passengers were on their way to Halifax and would enter Richmond station directly in the destruction zone the explosion would cause. He had reached the door when he stopped. Coleman went back to his desk, sat down in front of the telegraph machine, and began transmitting a warning message to all the stations on the railway line, asking the trains to stop before reaching Halifax. The message he transmitted in those final minutes was found recorded on the telegraph tapes at the stations that received it. It said simply that there was a ship loaded with explosives burning in the port of Halifax, and that trains should not enter the city. Vincent Coleman was still transmitting when the Mont-Blanc exploded. At 9:46 on the morning of December 6, 1917, the Mont-Blanc exploded. The force of the detonation was equivalent to approximately 2.5 kilotons of TNT, the largest accidental explosion in human history up to that moment. The shockwave traveled at more than 1,000 meters per second in every direction from the point where the ship was anchored. The Richmond pier disappeared. The firefighters of truck number 4 disappeared. The port workers who had moved closer to watch the fire disappeared. The Richmond neighborhood, with its wooden houses, its shops, its churches, and its schools, was completely destroyed in less than 1 second. The shockwave brought down buildings kilometers from the explosion point. In downtown Halifax, brick facades crumbled onto the streets. Windows exploded across the entire city simultaneously in a blast that was heard in Truro, 130 kilometers away. In Sydney, 340 kilometers away, seismographs registered the impact. In Prince Edward Island, 300 kilometers away, people came out into the streets to find out where that sound had come from. The tsunami generated by the explosion lifted water from the bay and threw entire ships onto the shore. The Emo, the Norwegian ship that had collided with the Mont-Blanc less than an hour earlier, was swept to the Dartmouth shore on the other side of the bay and ran aground in a field. The Mont-Blanc's anchor, weighing 500 kilograms, was found 4 kilometers from the explosion point. One of the ship's cannons was found 5.5 kilometers away. The smoke cloud that formed above the port rose 6 kilometers and was visible hundreds of kilometers away. Inside it, pieces of the Mont-Blanc rained back down to earth as metal shards. A fireball hundreds of meters in diameter expanded and contracted in seconds, generating a heat wave that set fire to everything that had survived the shockwave in Richmond. In the Richmond schools that were still standing after the initial explosion, Children who had been thrown against walls by the shockwave tried to get up amid broken glass and collapsed ceilings. In the neighborhood houses, people who had been looking out the window at the burning ship were struck by the glass that exploded inward, suffering serious eye injuries that, in many cases, would cause permanent blindness. It was the most common injury of the entire tragedy, and the doctors who arrived in Halifax in the following hours had never seen anything like it on such a large scale. On the morning of December 6th, after the smoke began to clear and survivors managed to move through the streets, what remained of Richmond was not a destroyed neighborhood. It was a void. The wooden houses that had sheltered the families of port workers, the shops that opened before 6 in the morning, the churches where memorial services for soldiers killed in Europe were held every week. Everything had disappeared within a radius of more than 1 kilometer around the explosion point. In their place, a flat landscape of rubble, mud, and metal fragments that no one could identify. The injured walked through the streets not knowing where to go. The hospitals closest to Richmond had been hit by the explosion. Victoria Hospital, less than 1 kilometer from the detonation point, had lost all its windows and part of its roof, but was still standing and received hundreds of injured in the first hours, with doctors and nurses operating without sufficient anesthesia, without blood for transfusions, and with improvised surgical instruments because the regular equipment had been destroyed or buried. Relief came from every direction with a speed that surprised even the Canadian authorities. Boston sent a train with doctors, nurses, medical supplies, and donation money on the night of December 6th itself, arriving in Halifax on the morning of the following day. Vincent Coleman was found in the rubble of the railway station. He was 43 years old. He left behind a wife and 4 children. The trains Coleman had warned were carrying a total of more than 700 passengers. All survived. The Halifax explosion killed 1,956 confirmed people, though the real number is likely higher because entire families were eliminated without leaving anyone to report the missing. 9,000 were injured. 25,000 people, nearly half the population of Halifax, were left homeless in the Canadian winter, with temperatures below zero, and a blizzard that arrived the night after the explosion and covered the rubble of Richmond under half a meter of snow. The official inquiry conducted in the following months concluded that the blame for the collision lay with the IMO, which had navigated on the wrong side of the channel. Mont-Blanc pilot Francis Mackey was arrested, tried, and acquitted. Captain Håkan From of the IMO had died in the explosion, along with almost his entire crew. The victims' families tried to hold the shipping companies legally responsible for the damages, and the lawsuits dragged on for decades without definitive resolution. Halifax was rebuilt in the following years with federal money and donations that arrived from across Canada, the United States, and Britain. The Richmond neighborhood came back into existence, with new houses built on the same foundations as the old ones, on streets that followed the same layout as before the explosion. The families that had survived returned. Other families arrived to fill the places of those who had disappeared. Life returned to the rhythm that had existed before December 6th, 1917. Comment down below where you're watching this from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. A big hug, and until the next reconstruction.